Hi. First of all, want to apologize for two things. One, my neighbors apparently got a new dog, and you're probably gonna hear him in the background. I'm gonna do my best to edit this so that it doesn't get too distracting, but I can't promise anything. And another thing, I want to apologize for is that my first video I posted 4 months ago, and then I didn't post anything else after that. My plan was to post a whole lot more. I was even thinking like, oh, maybe I could do this like a daily book discussion, and obviously that didn't work out. But I'm here now. I mean, I'm sure we all understand. Life is crazy right now, and I'm alive. If any of you were worried. And also, just want to say my first video that I posted on here where I talked about the most disturbing books I'd ever read is now at something like 700 views, which I was honestly thinking it would get maybe 10 or 12. So big, huge thank you to everybody who's watched it. A lot of people also left comments. I've been replying. The reception has been much more than I thought it would be. So I thought maybe there is, a little space for me here to discuss, what I like. So I, of course, love reading books, and I love reading horror. Horror is my favorite genre. And if there's anything I love more than horror literature, it's horror movies. I'm actually also a huge horror film fanatic. I've watched, I would say, thousands of them at this point, or maybe like 1,000 and then a few more, but I've watched a couple. Certainly not as prolific a horror film fan as some other people I've seen here on YouTube. I'm a fairly well, what would you call it? A learned fan. So I thought, well, maybe, there's a lot of horror literature that gets adapted into horror films. A lot of them are classics. A lot of them are garbage. A lot of them just don't work. Like the book's great, the film's not that good. Or maybe the book wasn't even that good, but the film actually made something more out of it. So I wanted to make this video today talking about that comparison. I'm going to talk about three very, very much classic horror novels from the 60s and 70s that have also been adapted into, absolutely amazing classic horror films. And I just kind of want to give my opinion on the two, compare them between each other, and then maybe at the end reach a consensus on whether I like the book or the movie more. So the first book I want to talk about is Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. This book was published in 1967, became a huge commercial success. It's actually considered to be the novel that sort of spearheaded this movement, this influx of horror literature, which exploded in the 70s and of course the 80s, because it dealt with themes of course, Satanism, but it also kind of melded it very seamlessly with this kind of slice of life, almost chick lit story about this newlywed couple who's moving into a brand new apartment, and it became this cultural phenomenon. Everybody loved it, and of course, eventually, as with most books, if everybody loves it, that means they're going to make a film about it. And indeed, the next year in 1968, Roman Polanski adapted it into his also classic horror movie of the same title, starring Mia Farrow. And so what I have to say, I love both of these. I think both the novel and the film are great. So let's do a couple of comparisons. And actually for this one, there's not going to be a lot of that. If you listen to the commentary track on this by Roman Polanski, this is the Criterion Collection edition. I'm not sure if you can find it in other editions, maybe. But he talks about, so he is a Polish filmmaker, of course, who was coming into America. I believe this is his first American film, but I could be completely wrong on that. But he had never adapted a written work before. And so when he was told, when he was hired by the William Castle's production team to direct this film, he actually did not have the slightest idea of what adapting a written work entailed. And he actually took it quite literally. If you listen to him talk about his first impressions on directing the book, he thought it had to be as loyal to the story as possible. And he took that so far that it almost feels like a carbon copy. If you read the book and then you watch the film, of course, his visual interpretations are his own. But in terms of the storyline, there's hardly anything left out that's in the book. From what I recall, there's a very specific plot point earlier in the book where Rosemary is they've just moved into the new apartment, and they are going to sleep, and then she has a nightmare about this very traumatic experience she had as a child when she was going to Catholic school. About there was some kind of contest going on, like in the school, and she cheated in it, and so the nuns were very harsh to her. They punished her, etc., etc. And so, you would think that kind of secondary plot line that doesn't really go anywhere. It's just there to kind of establish character and establish a bit of history as to Rosemary. That's usually something that gets cut out. But there's actually an entire scene dedicated to that in the book, where we see the dream that Rosemary's having. You could argue that that's a stylistic choice, and it certainly works to help build this dreamlike setup that certainly becomes a lot more prominent later on. But that's what I'm talking about when I say Roman Polanski adapted the book in a very, very literal sense. The story, I think, anybody that's interested in a video like this, I think, would be familiar with it. But if you're not, it's basically Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse, this couple living in New York, who are looking for a new apartment because they've just gotten married and they want to start a family. Guy Woodhouse, the husband, he is an actor, but he's not having a lot of luck with his roles. He does what is that line that keeps getting repeated? He was in Luther and Nobody Loves an Albatross and a lot of television films and commercials. So basically that's as far as his filmmaking expertise goes. And then they find this perfect apartment, in this very high-rise apartment in this building where all sorts of famous people have lived, and they say, of course, we'll take it. That's great. And then everything's going well. They're having a bit of financial struggles from what I can recall, but they're doing all right. And then they meet their neighbors, and their neighbors are this old couple who are seemingly very sweet. They're very nosy, and they start to get involved in their lives kind of right away. But little by little, they start to, get their hands in their personal lives more and more. And then eventually, Rosemary does get pregnant, but it happens after she has this very weird and lucid dream that she is being raped by the devil. And they kind of brush it off as, oh, it was just a dream, it was just a nightmare. And they, everything goes well, but the pregnancy starts to have a lot of weird things going on around it. The neighbors start acting weirder and weirder. They start inviting their friends into the Woodhouse's lives, and she starts to feel a lot of pain, a lot of weird cravings for like raw meat, and eventually, I'm not gonna spoil the ending, but I think what it's trying to do is leave it up to you. It's very ambiguous, even though at the end it seemingly confirms suspicions that Rosemary has been having this whole time, that, the neighbors are actually a Satanist cult who have impregnated her with the son of the devil. But it doesn't actually, it also sort of leads you to think, and I would say more so in the book, that Rosemary is actually not all that stable herself, that she might have some kind of psychological issues that she's working through, and she's projecting those onto her pregnancy and onto this old couple that they've just met. So it's just kind of, at the end, it's up to you. Was she really impregnated by the devil, or was she not? And of course, pop culture and parodies and all that will have you know that this is a book about, a lady who's pregnant with the son of Satan, because it just registers that black and white to a lot of people. But I think primarily the book and the film are concerned with exploring things like, hysteria, psychological issues revolving around pregnancy, a failing marriage. All these things I feel were a lot more prominent than just the horror itself, because there's actually not that much of it. Everything is just kind of suggested in the way that it's presented. As far as differences go, like I said, I think this takes on the psychological aspect and the interiority of Rosemary a lot more. But that just goes with the territory, I think, because novels are, of course, a lot more about consciousness and interiority than films are. Not that films can't do that, but inherently, we get a much broader view into the thoughts of a character in a book than in a film. But I think the film is also very visually stunning. There's a lot of visually mesmerizing sequences, specifically dream sequences that happen. Of course, very psychedelic, if you would want to call it that. That is a film from 1968. It is very much influenced by that. And I think, I like them both a lot, but if I had to choose one, I would say the film is actually preferred by me. And I know that might be a little sacrilegious to a lot of people, because we're taught all the way from elementary, the book's always better. You should always read the book. The book is great, obviously. It's a huge classic, and, it's sold millions and millions of copies. But as far as the adaptation of the story, I think the film offers a lot more sort of compelling moments, because it turns it into a visual journey. And I think that visual journey I enjoyed a lot more than, the sort of written work of Ira Leving. But I'm only picking because I kind of have to for the video, but I think that they are both great. But if you have watched the film and you were interested in reading the book because you thought you missed out on some things or details, you didn't really miss out on a lot. But again, this is kind of an anomaly, because it's an adaptation that is very, very faithful. And again, because Roman Polanski thought that's what it had to be. But of course, Roman Polanski has a very distinct visual style, and I think it translates well into adapting the book into the film. And so the second book and film that I want to talk about, like I said, Rosemary's Baby sort of spearheaded this explosion of horror literature into the market. But if Rosemary's Baby did that, this book sort of took that and multiplied it times 1,000. That book, of course, being The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. And this book was published in 1971. And so the following year, it was adapted into a film by William Friedkin. He was definitely not someone very well known for doing horror, but nonetheless, in 1972, he made his own film adaptation of The Exorcist. And so, once again, we get into a kind of case of extreme similarities, because The Exorcist, the screenplay for the film, was actually written by William Peter Blatty, the author of the novel. And of course, there was a lot of contention between the two, because I think William Friedkin also insisted on adapting a lot of things that could have seemingly been left out in a film adaptation. Particularly the opening sequence takes place in Iraq, which is kind of disjointed from the rest of the film. So in terms of adaptation, we kind of have to make a specification for the film, because there exists two different versions of it, which I feel are very different from each other, even though they only add some minutes worth of scenes. Those scenes, I think, make a huge difference. And of course, there's the original theatrical version, the one that William Friedkin sort of approved as the one that should be released on theaters back in 1972. And then it had a re-release in the 90s. I'm not sure when, 1999, I want to say. And it was it was titled the version you've never seen. And it was added scenes that take place in the book but were cut out of the film. And it's sort of been, there's sort of some humor in there, because actually what's the version you've never seen, which here it's called the director's cut, would actually more or less be the writer's cut in some way, because some of those scenes were scenes that Will and Peter Blatty insisted should be in the film, not necessarily William Friedkin, the director. So there's some contention there, and I think it's for the purposes of comparing the two, I want to talk about the original theatrical version, because that's the one that I think contrasts the most with this one. And of course, we have to talk about the mission that the writer and the director both had when presenting this story. But first, the plot is very simple. Somewhat simplistic in its concept. There's seemingly a demon that comes from Iraq, and this priest, Father Marin, has fought him in the past. The demon, of course, being Pazuzu, who one day seemingly descends onto the McNeil family, which is Chris McNeil and her daughter Reagan McNeil, who live in this beautiful home in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. I just noticed, kind of similar to this, which I wasn't really thinking about, but Chris McNeil is also an actress, like Guy Woodhouse, and she, they're rich. They have like this seemingly perfect life. They love each other. She loves her daughter loves her, but then her daughter starts acting erratically. She kind of starts behaving in a strange way. She starts cussing. She starts to have night terrors. She says her bed is shaking. Chris McNeil literally sees every single psychiatrist and psychologist in the city, and they all kind of try to explain to her, well, it could be paranoid schizophrenia. We're not sure. We think we're going to have to run a couple of tests. We think it might also be some sort of state of self-suggestion, which is paired with hysteria, blah, blah, blah. They try to hurl all these 1970s psychiatry terms at her, but none of them seem to make sense. None of the treatments seem to work. None of the therapies seem to work. And eventually, Chris is driven to the conclusion that her daughter is possessed. Now, like I said, the two adaptations are very similar. And the book has, a very different tone. Even though the story is quite the same, I feel like the direction that it tries to take is very different from The Exorcist. I feel like The Exorcist film is very much a sort of a zoomed in view into the experience that Reagan is going through throughout her possession. And of course, at the end, it is affirmed that indeed it was a demon inside her who was driven out by the sacrifice of these two priests. But the book actually, for a lot of the passages, reads like some kind of medical record. I mean, really reads like you're going through medical records of this little girl who's, exhausted all psychological possibility. You go through passages and passages of all the tests that are being performed, all the theories that the doctors have as to what could be wrong with her, previous cases that might mirror what she's going through. It's a very extensively done here. I would say William Peter Blatty does a phenomenal job at researching what he's talking about, and he says it with a lot of authority and confidence, and I think that just makes the final conclusion that there is a demonic possession at work that much more shocking and scary. And also, I think that it illustrates a lot of like that human helplessness, that, humans are combating something that they don't understand with tools that don't work and theories that are wrong. And that makes it a very exasperating read. There is some of that in the film, but I feel like it's kind of gleamed over a little bit. I mean, there's that famous scene in the film where she's going through, they're doing some kind of spinal fluid check on her, and or they're doing an encephalogram of her brain, and they're injecting all these things into her, and it's very real, it's very freaky, and I think that's where the kind of cinema verite that William Friedkin is mostly known for kind of comes in. Because there's no demon, there's no monster, there's none of that. And even throughout the whole film until the very end, you don't really see a lot of that. But a lot of the more kind of realistic, like hyper realist sequences that we go through are just as horrifying, because we feel the helplessness of the little girl and we feel the helplessness of the mom. They're very effective, but there's only a couple of scenes like that in the film, whereas the book dedicates, I think, hundreds of pages of its content to describing these medical procedures. And then at the end, there's no answers. And you kind of feel as desperate and helpless as the characters do. But not to say, I mean, the film does have its merits. I think the book is more of like a... William Peter Blatty, who was, I think, a religious man, wanted to make a film about the evil of Satan and how it preys on us and how we need to defend ourselves with the weapons of God or something like that. And I feel like this is a lot more of an exploration of the psychology, the psychological state, the deteriorating psychological state of a family, and also of a priest who's lost his faith. That would be Damien Karras, who, is also in the book, obviously, but I think the book is kind of trying to get us to know, Damien Karras sort of finds his faith at the end when he combats this demon. And the film is a little more like, you don't really know what he's going through, but you feel for him. I think this is a very sad film, in my opinion. I think in one of the many viewings that I've given it, it's actually made me tear up a little bit, because the character of Damien Karras is so tragic, and I think that that might be the crucial difference between the two. This is a very tragic film. And this is a very horrific book, but ultimately very hopeful book on top of that. So I think there's a difference in tone. And also, I wanted to say this reads a lot like a detective story. The character of Kinderman, who is just sort of at the edges of the film, the periphery of the action, takes a much more prominent role. And there's things like red herrings, as he conducts an investigation, because Burke Dennings, the director that Chris McNeil was working with, was mysteriously murdered when he fell down a flight of stairs right outside Reagan's bedroom. He was a drunk, so they write it off as an accident. He was drunk and he slipped down. Detective Kinderman is called to the case, and he's trying to find out whether it was an accident or whether he was actually murdered by Reagan by being pushed out of her window. And that takes a lot of prominence in the book. You go through the investigative process in its entirety along with Kinderman. And like I said, it's just kind of in the peripheries of the film. The film is much more interested in elevating the horror aspects in a way which are present in the book, but I would say they are more prominent and more elevated in the film. And I think it just depends on what kind of story you are trying to read. This is ultimately a religious message packed in a kind of detective story / crime procedural / I would even say medical drama in some cases. A lot of it reminds me of shows like that, like House or something like that, but not as terrible. And this, I think, is more of a horror film, but it's also, the idea that William Friedkin is not a horror director lends a lot of like different waves of visual genre into the film, not just horror. It's not just things going boom and bump in the night. Like there's none of that actually. It's like the most that you see happen in here is towards the end in the exorcism sequence, but for the majority of its duration, it's more of like a tragic melodrama of a family that's falling apart. And I think I like that. I'm a fan, of course, of things in horror films going boom and going crazy, but something a lot more subtle like this is also, I think, sometimes a lot more successful in terms of storytelling prowess. But I love the book as well. And if I have to pick one, I think just being a horror fan, I prefer the film version. But reading this was also very harrowing, very despairing, and I recommend this thoroughly. This wins maybe by like an inch of, like this wins by a hair, but they are both amazing. And I think that, you would do no wrong in picking either of these, but I recommend that you actually, go through the two of them. And there's a lot of information in the book that actually helps illustrate a lot of the plot points in the film a lot more. Again, because the nature of a book is to go more into an interior detail of a character's profile. So I think the two should go together, but if you're going to pick one, for me, it's the film, just because it's such a classic. And then we kind of went through, a book and film that were extremely similar to a book and a film that had, some differences, mostly the same in terms of, linear storytelling, but they had, some key differences. And for the last one, I want to talk about a book and a film that are the same story, but the adaptations couldn't be any more different. So the book I'm going to talk about is The Shining by Stephen King, and that would later be adapted. This was published in 1977. This is my copy that I've had for a long time, since I was like 12 years old. Very near and dear to my heart. First Stephen King novel I ever read. And it was adapted 3 years later in 1980 by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. Why do I say that they're famously different? Well, Stanley Kubrick took a lot of artistic liberties, so to speak, in adapting the novel. And Stephen King, upon seeing the adaptation, famously said that he hated it and that it had nothing to do with the book that he had written, and that, Stanley Kubrick got it all wrong, from the casting to the way the story's told to the way the story's shown. So lots and lots of differences. What do they have in common? Well, the core plot proceeding is pretty much the same. There's a family, Jack and Wendy Torrance, and their 5-year-old son Danny. Jack has struggled with alcoholism for most of his life, and he lost his job that he had previously because of an altercation that occurred, because of his temper and because of his drinking problem. They're going through extreme financial struggles, and so their last glimmer of hope is to for Jack to accept this job working at the Overlook Hotel in Colorado, which is up in the mountains, which closes off during the winter. And so basically his job that he accepts is as caretaker. He is going to be looking after the Overlook Hotel throughout the winter. And they're going to be completely isolated in there. Turns out that the Overlook may or may not be haunted depends on what version you're watching or reading. and the ghosts are primarily perceived by Danny, who has some sort of psychic power, which is called the Shining. He shines. He can read people's thoughts, and he can see images of things that have happened or will happen. And so he is, of course, terrified of going up to the Overlook Hotel, but he doesn't want to tell his parents because they really need the job. And eventually the Overlook starts acting up, ghosts start appearing, and we feel like they are in a way influencing or possessing Jack Torrance, and will eventually lead him to attempt to murder his family. So what are some key differences? Well, there's a lot. I think primarily you have the fact that ghosts are either very real and very prominent, or only suggested and very ambiguous. The Overlook in the novel by Stephen King is a haunted building. There's ghosts in it. Danny sees them, Jack sees them, Wendy sees them, and they are very much haunting them in a real way. In The Shining, they appear, but they only appear in a way that seems, like I said, suggested. You don't see a lot of paranormal activity quite as much as you see here. What you see mostly is, the famous sequences of the twin girls who are not in the book, the dead woman in the bathtub who is in the book, and you see, of course, Jack Torrance has a conversation with some ghosts in the gold ballroom. That happens here, yes, but in a much more isolated way. You never see multiple characters interact with the ghosts at the same time, which I think is very key, because that does happen here, and it kind of lets you know, okay, well, there is ghosts because they're all seeing the same thing. Here they all see very different things, and you might interpret it as being a psychological projection of their own paranoia and cabin fever or whatever. And so there's also a very big difference in terms of what is driving Jack Torrance to murder his family. I think in the movie, from the beginning, you can kind of tell that he can't fucking stand his family. I don't know if Stanley Kubrick meant for that, but I mean, he is a fantastic director. I think that if you perceive something that's going on in his movies, he very much wants you to. And that was the main critique that Stephen King had with the film. He called it a very, very cold film, full of cold characters who are very distant from each other. And that certainly does happen. You can tell that Jack kind of hates his wife and his kid. He never shows any kind of nurturing or affection towards them. And then very quickly he turns to wanting to kill him. And I think, again, that kind of leads you to the interpretation that maybe they were crazy from the beginning. They were in danger from the beginning. If he wasn't going to kill him in the Overlook, he was going to kill him somewhere else. And here, we start with this very warm, very human family portrait. And I think that's what Stephen King does best. He familiarizes you with characters. He paints a very real human picture of who they are, what they're about, what they've been through since childhood. And believe me, Stephen King is very thorough, very, very thorough in building his characters. But I think that that's a good thing. I think he's a brilliant character-driven author. And so you get the sense, you get the loving, embraces that they all have for each other. You don't get a lot of that here. This paints a more complete picture of the characters and what goes on in their lives and what they've been through, what they've struggled with, and what they continue to struggle with. I feel like Jack Torrance's alcoholism and his struggle with it was a lot more prominent, a lot more real, and a lot more detailed in the book. And I'm sure it comes from a lot of personal experience. As we know, Stephen King himself also struggled a lot with alcohol and drugs. And that's what feels so harrowing. You know, you feel his desperation, you feel his need to, want to be a better father, a better husband, but then eventually being pulled back by this, by this vice that he has and this broken life that he just can't seem to shake off. All those personal struggles are completely sort of missing from the film, I think. I don't think Stanley Kubrick does that well of a job in characterizing the people that he's working with here. But I think that's because that's not what he's truly interested in. I think that this is very much about the family in the Overlook, if I have to simplify it. This is very much about the family living in the Overlook, and this is very much about just the Overlook itself. I mean, the just painstaking filming of hallways and hotel rooms and the setting in this film is fantastic. It's beautifully and disturbingly shot in some way. You kind of feel afraid of the Overlook just by looking at it, and that is of course the work of Stanley Kubrick's mastery at understanding tone and understanding unsettling visuals to a completely further degree than I think most horror film directors do. Again, this is kind of a case similar to William Friedkin. This is a film, this is a horror film adapted by somebody who was not known to make horror films. And so I think that a lot of his expertise sort of bleeds through in that it creates a completely different kind of horror film that any you've ever seen. And I think that's what's so singular and special about the film. It sounds like I'm kind of bashing it, but I actually really love the film. But I really love the novel as well. Like I said, this is more about actual ghosts. And this is a lot more about the struggle of a father trying to keep his family together. There's constant threats from Wendy and Danny that they're going to leave him. And there's constant threats to, their stability. And that goes into a lot more detail. And also, something I don't quite care for is that Jack Torrance, the main character, or one of the main characters in here, is an author. And of course, that's the case with most of Stephen King's novels. I mean, write about what you know, right? So he's an author, and you get, of course, a lot of descriptions about his writing process and what he's writing about, what he's written about before, what he wants to write, etc., etc. A center plot point of the novel is that Jack Torrance has been trying to write a play, but instead he becomes seduced by the Overlook's shady history into writing a book about the Overlook itself. And there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of description as to his writing process that I really don't care for. Those were the most lackluster points of the novel for me. Some people might be into it, but I'm not. I was more interested in, what's going on in the hotel, what the ghosts were planning. But I think he builds up suspense equally as effectively as the film does. This is a very suspenseful film, of course. And a very, I would agree with Stephen King's assessment that this is a very cold, inhuman film. But I would disagree in the fact that that's a bad thing. I think that that's a phenomenal take to have when making a horror film. And I think it just kind of depends on what you're into, what you're kind of looking for. But I would say I personally like the novel more. I like the characters more just because I was actually more invested in them. This is a great study of place, a sense of place. this is, of course, a phenomenal classic horror film. I will not deny it that. I will agree with that assessment. But when it comes to the story, when it comes to the characters, when it comes to experiencing the story of Jack Torrance and his family, I would say I like the novel a lot more. And just also maybe because I'm a bigger fan of Stephen King. I've read everything that he's written up to a certain year, and then it got kind of bad. But I'm a huge fan, and I think that this is one of his best novels, definitely. And he does in here what he does best. You know, he builds these characters that you care for in a setting that you are absolutely horrified by. And he does it so effectively. If you stuck all the way through, again, thank you for watching. I appreciate that. I promise I'm going to try to post videos a lot more often. And yeah, again, thank you for all the reception that my other videos gotten. I do have plans to talk about a lot more things. And if you have any suggestions of maybe what you like me to make a video on, please let me know. And yeah, thanks for watching.